I'm Rebecca Montgomery from the University of Minnesota. I'm in the Department of Forest Resources there, and I'm a faculty member. I do research on plant response to climate change, and I teach a forest ecology course and a field ecology course. Actually came down this morning from my field course, which is based up in Cloquet, Minnesota. Can I just get a sense for you guys' age groups? How many, like, elementary? Couple elementary, middle school, and high school. Okay, a lot. All right. So I'm going to talk today about the topic of phenology. So how many people, how many of you guys have heard of phenology or this term, are familiar with the term? Many of you. Well, I like to start kind of providing a definition for this. Phenology is derived from the Greek word pheno, which means to show or appear. And it's the study of recurring events in biological life cycles. So things like when do plants break bud, when do birds migrate, are all within the purview of this study of phenology. Phenology is very sensitive to environmental variations, and I like it because it's organism-centered. The organism itself, the plant or the bird, the insect, is telling you whether it's perceiving a cue or not. So you're kind of reading the animals and plants when you look at phenology. So phenology has a long history. This is a quote from a letter from Thomas Jefferson, a letter that he wrote to his daughter, talking about their gardens, saying, "We had not peas nor strawberries here till the 8th of this month. On the same day I heard the first whippoorwill. Martins appeared here on the 29th of April. Tell me when you shall have peas up, when every kind of tree blossoms and puts forth leaves, when each kind of flower blooms." And Jefferson was very interested in phenology. He was an avid agriculturalist and gardener. And what I'm showing down on the bottom here is actually an excerpt from one of his journals. And it's really neat. It says, "The calendar of bloom of flowers in 1782. And it has the months across the top, and then you can see these, let me cross over here. You can see this is narcissus, so daffodils, and this is when it started blooming in March. And then the line is how long it bloomed and when it stopped blooming. And so Jefferson took records of these things. It was sort of a personal, something that he was personally interested in, and kept his own records in his own garden and wrote letters corresponding with family members on this topic. And phenology, I would say, is something that people have been part of people's lives, whether you know it or call it that, for a long time. And how many of you pay attention to when the lilacs bloom, when leaves come out on the trees? On the West Coast, what we call serviceberry here is called shadbush, because it blooms when the shad run through the rivers. And so there's this, this has been part of, I think, human observations and part of humans' connection to the land for a long time. It's emerged recently very strongly in the scientific community because phenology has kind of provided at this point one of the most coherent signals of organisms responding to changing climate. So from animals coming out of hibernation early, to birds changing their migration pattern, to plants blooming at different times, all of these different kinds of events across the globe have been indicating that plants and animals' natural systems are sensing change. And And this change has been linked to the change in our climate. And so that brings up for me, and I think for a lot of us, three big questions. One, how is phenology changing? Two, why is it changing? And what are some of the mechanisms? And then what are the consequences for natural and human systems? And so I'm going to talk actually about this first. And the talk, I'm really going to kind of lay out, well, why should we all care and be interested in phenology? You know, why might this be important? Why is it coming out as a signal of climate change, and why are there these linkages between phenology and climate change? And how are these things changing? More details on that. And then I'm going to close today talking about, well, how do you monitor phenology? How do people approach taking records? And what are some resources out there if you wanted to incorporate phenology and taking these kinds of records into your classroom? I would argue, and I'll kind of jump out of the formal talk here, that this is a really wonderful way to connect people to the land and to make those linkages between how the natural systems are responding to the climate, and kind of give a more hands-on view of the changing climate to kids and adult learners as well. So what are the consequences? Why should we care about phenology? Well, the first thing is that phenology for plants determines the length of the growing season. And I just show the season in the year here from a project I work on from bud burst in early May through expansion of leaves, full leaves, and then senescence in the fall. And that entire cycle is the length of the growing season. It's the amount of time that the plant can take in carbon dioxide and put that towards growing larger or reproducing, defending itself from things that want to eat it, things like that. It's important not only for something like this, a tree, but also for all of our agricultural systems. The length of the growing season really determines the growing season for food production as well. And that's a phenological event. The other reason phenology is important is it's related to risks that in this case plants face. So when something leaves out or blooms, especially in the spring, is related to its risk for frost. And we saw some headlines this year because we had a really early spring, and then we had later season frosts. And what we're seeing actually is that in the climate records, springs are getting earlier on average, but our last frost date is not moving as fast. So that creates this situation where things might leaf out and then face a frost later on. And for leaves on a tree, that mostly they can resprout their leaves. But for flowers, it's kind of a one-shot thing. If your flowers get frosted, no reproduction in that year, which from an ecological perspective has consequences. From an economic perspective, if you're growing fruits for crops, it has consequences as well. What else? Plant-animal interactions. Pollination. Pollination depends on the butterfly emerging or arriving from migration when the flowers are out, when the nectar resources are there. So these food webs, these biological interactions are really dependent on phenology, on the timing of events. Another biological interaction is plant-pest relations. Anyone know what this is? Tent caterpillar. This is forest tent caterpillar on aspen. That's a little spruce tree that has spruce budworms like to eat those new leaves. And so when the plants leaf out and when those insects come out, that's a phenological timing issue. And that's something that is important in terms of how big the outbreak might be in any given year. Those insects are food for birds and migrating birds. So if those insects come out early because it's warmer and the birds migrate and they don't come, they're not changing their time of migration, their food source might not be there or may be different. So these food webs and interactions are really important. There's also other human impacts. Maple syrup, these are headlines from this year because this was such an interesting phenological weather year. You know, small businesses, maple syrup producers, this is a rough year for them. That's a phenological event, the timing of the maple run. Walleye, I don't know if anyone fishes, but there was this question about, let's move the walleye opener forward. But then they ended up not, because we actually don't know enough, they didn't feel like they knew enough about whether the spawning and whatnot had happened earlier or not, so I said, well, it's safer just to leave it. But that's phenology in action, that's phenology influencing us in terms of recreation, in terms of small businesses. So kind of to summarize, why does phenology matter? Biological interactions really depend on these timing of events. The length of the growing season, which influences productivity of our forests, of our agriculture, that influences the global carbon cycle, which I'm not going to get into details, can influence human health. Pollen season. Pollen shedding is a phenological event. Mosquitoes. When is it high mosquito time? That's also a timing event. Phenology also matters, and I'll show you more on this as we go through this, because it's sensitive to global change, to this climate change. It's an indicator, and not only is it an indicator, but because it's sensitive, it may be a signal of vulnerabilities in our natural systems to climate change. And then on the people side, I feel like phenology really resonates with the public, because I think we all notice these things. It's part of just, I would say, human nature to notice these things. And it's also a place where we can really make connections with the natural world, monitoring, watching these things. I saw those changes and I was looking and observing in a way that I hadn't before. It's a great way to hone observation skills, but also create that personal connection, because it's like your friends coming and going through the seasons. And I think that's where linking to education, this is a really nice way to kind of has really strong and easy linkages. So kind of take-home message one, phenology is important biologically, ecologically, and to human systems. I want to take a minute to see if people have questions before I kind of step into the next piece of this. Questions or comments?
Have you seen that one picture where that person went out in their yard and over the course of the 360 days took a picture at each angle?
I have not.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be amazing.
It was on display over at the Minnesota Center for Book Arts.
Okay.
So it's out there somewhere.
Yeah, that
And
sounds
it was
really neat.
pretty amazing.
Yep, yeah. Other questions or comments?
Well, I just want to say that the maple syrup, that affects my ability to make smoothies in the summer. Luckily, I stocked up because I knew summer was coming, and then that headline came out like a couple weeks later, and I was like, oh, good thing I did that.
I stocked up too with my favorite maple syrup producer up in the Cloquet area, because I knew that it was going to be more expensive come summertime, and it is. It was. Other comments at this point? Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is how is it changing? Give you a little bit more of a view into how phenology is changing. And to do this, I want to start out kind of talking about, well, how do we see phenology changing through time? Anyone have any idea? If you wanted to say, oh, leafing times or blooming times or migration times are changing, and link that to climate change, where would we look? How would we do that?
Migration routes are changing.
Okay.
I noticed that from where I live, that I get different birds coming through our area that never happened.
So observations. So we get that from observations, and can we get a sense for how it's changing from, a couple years of observations?
Maybe family rituals, like, well, I don't know, going out and getting your holiday tree or something.
Mm-hmm.
Years ago, there was tons of snow, and then no snow, and
Mm-hmm.
some other family rituals.
Yeah, so both of these kind of bring up this idea of observing the timing events over years. And that's where we can start looking and seeing how phenology might be changing through long-term records that people have collected. And what are those records like, and where do they come from? Well, this is a quote from Sand County Almanac, written by Aldo Leopold. In June, as many as a dozen species may burst their bud on a single day. No man can heed all of these anniversaries. No man can ignore all of them. And this is Leopold at the shack in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And Leopold kept phenology records. So, and so did many of these naturalist, early biologists kept these records. And he kept them every weekend. He'd go out and say, what's happening? What do I see? When do I see this? And those records form the basis of a historical data set that we can go back and analyze. And so I'm going to show you some data from that. This is from a paper that his daughter, Nina Leopold Bradley, published. I'm going to just walk you guys through this. It's a whole bunch of panels, but they're all the same. They're years, 1900 through 2000. And then this is day of year with starting at January 1st and just counting. So this is day 100 is sometime in March, I think, March 15th, March 20th, something like that. So as we go up, this is later in the year, earlier in the season. And then each of these dots is a year, and these are Leopold's records. So when did slender penstemon bloom in this particular year? And then these over here on this part are his daughters. So what happened is Leopold collected records at his farm, and then in the early 80s, Nina went back there, she moved there, and she picked up his record keeping again. And so this represents a record from 1940 to 2000 with a big gap in the middle. And we can look, has the timing changed? And what we see is that for some things, these right here, the lines point down. So that means that the date is earlier now than it was back in the 1940s. And then some are just flat. They really haven't changed their timing. And this is one of the first scientific publications to start pulling data, these kinds of data together and looking, do we see change? Are the organisms showing us change? And what I think was really amazing about this is that they show really neat thing that some are and some aren't. And that really begs the question, why? And what does that mean? What if the phlox blooms, but a pollinator for it isn't coming out earlier, right? So what if this kind of shows this potential for mismatch in these food web interactions. Now another naturalist who collected phenology data is, do you guys know anyone know who this old guy is? Thoreau, this is Thoreau, and I guess it says Walden, and it says Thoreau. Anyway, Thoreau collected a lot of phenological data in his journals, and they've analyzed it and see that for a number of species, they are blooming earlier than 150 years ago. One species, blueberry, is almost 3 weeks earlier in terms of its bloom. This is kind of on average. And both of these really give us this example of the importance of these legacy data sets. And for me, it's always like, where are they? You know, someone probably wrote on their calendars and it's stuck in a box in the attic, right? You know, I think about my grandpa out in the Dakotas and, you know, wondering, like taking little notes on the calendar, and then those calendars, you know, getting packed away in the attic, and there's, you know, so I'm always wondering, where are those legacy data sets, and if we could find them, what might they tell us about what's happening here? And I have one, there's one data set that I've been working on from St. Paul. And this is the same kind of format as that last graph. The year is across the bottom. This is a record started in the 40s, every year to 1991. This person walked to work every day, collected and wrote down his observations of about 10 different phenological events. And then you can say, okay, well, when did, in this case we're looking at, when did aspen leaves come out? So this is, each dot is when they came out that year. And there's a lot of variation, which is why we need these long data sets. Because, you know, some years are late, some years are early, and so we need to have a longer data set to see whether there's any trend. This is my lab, started to kind of pick up where they left off, collecting the same kind of information. And again, for here in St. Paul, we see this downward trend, which means earlier. On average, aspen leaves are coming out 1 to 2 weeks earlier than they did in the 1940s. Yep.
It just occurred to me that so many books, children's literature, and oral histories are outdated now because of, you know, the exponential rise of climate change. I mean, where, you know, maybe you'd sit down with your child, I don't know, 25 years ago or something, and read a book, and that book no longer holds.
You mean like they talk about something blooming in June and now that blooms in May? So take-home message 2. Phenology of plants and animals is changing. And largely, I've shown you mostly springs. We're seeing earlier arrival, earlier blooms, and leafing. Fall's changing too, though. In terms of the woody trees, the leaves tend to stick around longer. But what's interesting for things that, you know, blooming herbaceous things, it seems like if they bloom early, they're done blooming earlier, and if they emerge earlier, they senesce earlier. So rather than extending the growing season, some of these are just moving it forward. And there's some really interesting information from Greenland where the caribou track, or historically have tracked changing day lengths to time their migrations inland to calve. And day lengths aren't really changing there. But the food resources for the caribou are. And what's happening in Greenland is that the caribou are reaching their calving grounds, and their food is already, you know, past the best state for them to feed on it. So it's already kind of all hardened up and harder to digest and not such good food source. And they're starting to see declines in caribou population because of declines in reproduction, because the success isn't as good because their food resources are in a different phenological state. So a lot of different kinds of patterns happening here, from earlier springs and later falls to just shifted windows of blooming.
That was my question with respect to the Leopold responders, non-responders.
Yep.
Has anybody checked to see whether the non-responders are more a photoperiod type of situation as opposed to ones that are temperature related?
That is an excellent question, and that really leads into my next part. So Yes and no is the answer to that. And I'm gonna move into the next part and answer as I go to make sure everyone's on the same page about what your question was. So the next part of this talk is why. Why are these changing? What are the underlying mechanisms? And I ask the same question as that. Why are some things changing and some not? And I think the answer lies in those things that cue phenology. So what are some of the factors that cue the plants to leaf out or to start losing their leaves or birds to migrate?
Abscission layers lose the leaves, and then they start growing, and isn't that related to quantity of chlorophyll?
Okay, but so leaves fall off when there's a little abscission layer, but what cues them to start making that little abscission layer?
Isn't that angle of the sun?
Angle of the sun. Did I hear day length? So daylight is one cue for phenology. The lengthening days, the shortening days, it's a constant signal. And it's one that changes through the seasons, and animals and plants can use and say, okay, when the day is this long, it's spring. When the day gets shorter or is this short, winter is coming, and the plant starts to kind of do all the changes to go into dormancy. Or a migrating birds, when the day length hits something, let's go. So one of the cues is day length. What's one of the other cues? Temperature. So those are the kind of our big things. Temperature and photoperiod. And the temperature comes as the fall and winter chilling. And here I'm all talking about seasonal environments, cold environments, like we have here, and warming in spring. And then we have day length. So looking at those cues, what comes to mind when you're thinking about climate change?
The timing of the warming and cooling has changed.
Yep.
That's changed to earlier.
Okay. So the timing that warming and chilling happens has changed. What else?
Because it's not consistent. It will warm and then it'll freeze, and then stuff is already started and things that should melt don't melt when they're supposed to melt. And other things
Right. So there's variability, and there's different aspects from when it starts getting warm, but then we have frost risk. What about this day length in climate change? Day length isn't changing. And so that says if an organism is using day length, the climate's kind of going to change out from under them potentially. And that is what people argue in terms of those responders and non-responders. Some of these bird migrants, those that use photoperiod, those that are long distance migrants, there's some evidence that if they overwinter in the tropics, the temperatures aren't changing much there, then those species, they use the same kind of cues. They come back and spring has sprung. Short distance migrants that, say, overwinter in the south of the U.S., there's more changing climate signal there that they track, and they are better at tracking and coming back earlier if it's an earlier spring. Question.
I'm not familiar with the term photo
Okay.
length, I think you said. Is that?
Photo period.
Photo
Thank
period.
you. And if I use any term, do not be shy to jump in and say that. So photo period is just day length. How long is the day?
Wait, did you just say, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Did you just say that, species that migrate shorter,
Distances.
yeah, say that again?
So something that overwinters in like the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee or Georgia, spring comes earlier there now than it did before. And so they will sense the changing timing, the changing temperatures, and start their migration earlier.
But isn't that the same as longer? Like, what about the whales order? I mean, what's a long?
Well, long would be, I'm thinking more like something that maybe overwinters in Panama or Costa Rica or Colombia, area where climate fluctuations are very small, there's not much seasonality, and there's not a strong signal of change there.
So like monarchs?
So monarchs, although monarchs are in Mexico, so that, you know, I actually, that's a question for Karen Oberhauser, who I'm actually not sure how variable their overwintering grounds. I think it has been a concern because it's to the south and it's more tropical, that if they're using local environmental signals that aren't changing, then they will be returning out of sync with their nectar resources. Did that answer your question? No.
That's okay. Probably as we go on, it'll be answered.
Okay. Other comments,
Well, I was just
questions?
wondering, because in Africa at least, wouldn't you say that water, availability of
Yes.
water is
So
one?
Africa,
Is there anything here that is similar?
I don't know. In the US, phenology in the desert areas are absolutely tied to rainfall and monsoons. So when it gets wet, things flower. And if the rains change and the timing of the rains change, the seasons change. Around here, most things, it's more these environmental cues and the length of the day. And what's interesting is we don't really know what's more important, at least for plants here. People have not done that experimental work, and so there's a lot of uncertainty. You know, if something is following the day length, it's gonna be respond less to a warmer spring. But we don't know who uses a day length to tell it let's bloom and who uses temperature in terms of the organisms. Or we have a very limited understanding of that. And that's a real limitation. And that's why having people collecting records is important, because those records can help us learn. And that really gets me to the next piece. And I'm going to quote Leopold again, because he was a phenology, he loved phenology, and he has this wonderful quote. So here he says, "From the beginnings of history, people have searched for order and meaning in these events," meaning these timing events. "But only a few have discovered that keeping records enhances the pleasure of the search and also the chance of finding order and meaning." These are the phenologists. So Leopold kept records, and those records have turned out, the records he kept, the records that other people have kept, have turned out to be really important in us seeing order and meaning and change in these events related to climate change. And so I love this quote because it really is kind of a call to keep records. And that's what the rest of my talk is about. What do people record? I'm going to talk a little bit about record keeping because, one, this is something that is important for researchers now to be able to answer some of these questions. We need data. And phenology data is hard to get. I can't be all over the nation or all over the state looking at when things are happening. But the people that live out across the state can. And so I'm really interested in inspiring people to take records. And I would say it partly selfishly because those records are wonderful data for research that I want to do. But I also think that there's satisfaction in keeping those records too for people, and there's learning that can happen, and as also in an educational framework, getting kids out and making these observations gives them that connection to the outdoors, hones those observation skills that are really the basis in science of all that we do. You know, science starts with observing something, and kids need to learn, how do I observe? And so I'm going to talk about what do people record, and then I'm going to talk about some national level efforts to record, to introduce you guys to that, and the educational resources associated with those that could be taken in and applied in classrooms and after school programs and whatnot. So what do people record? They record bud burst. They record leaf coloring. They record migration of butterflies, of birds, emergence of insects, things like that. People record non-biological events like ice out. We have this wonderful ice out record for Lake Minnetonka.
You said wonderful? That's terrible.
Well, not Minnetonka, but for lakes in general. I shouldn't say Minnetonka because I don't know the Minnetonka record.
You don't want to be ice. That causes fish.
Right. We have, what I mean by wonderful record is that there is a nice long record that we can understand how ice is changing. No, earlier ice out isn't, I'm not saying earlier ice out is wonderful. So, okay, let's see. How do people record? A lot of people record it in journals, in calendars, informally. You know, before people kept journals, I think phenology events were kept in oral histories and stories and songs. So people, you know, write it down, keep notes someplace. These kinds of records often have many species, but what is being recorded is usually unique to the observer. It's kind of a personal journal. It's what that person's interested, how they're defining whether a leaf is out or what color the leaf is unique to that person. So there's different criteria for the observations, not really a standard. So with these kinds of records, it's often hard to compare, you know, the person in St. Paul to the person in Cloquet to the person in Grand Marais. But one of the things they have is contextual information. There's stories associated with the observations. You know, I saw this bird, and then there's a story and often information about when they saw it, what it was like. So there's this other information. But if, as a researcher, and if you're trying to look for these signals of climate change, it's hard to get data out of these personal records. More recently, and actually this is old, this is a bird record, but there have emerged kind of formal approaches to collecting data where an organization might say, let's monitor red maple. And this is how you should do it and define things. So fewer species, many observers following the same thing. Same criteria for observations, standards, and common observations, which means we can compare across a large area. But sometimes one of the drawbacks is that there isn't that rich extra information, that rich what else was observed that might be important to interpreting those. Often these are digital or organized on data sheets, which means for a researcher like me, they're easier to analyze. But on the flip side, if you're the observer, there's kind of a lack of personalized touch. Someone's telling you, do this and do it this way. And so depending on your motivation for making the records, this maybe isn't as fun, or this isn't why you got into doing it in the first place. So how do people record and what? Well, sometimes, and one of probably by far the most common, is people record the date that they first see something. The date the aspens leaf out, the date the black-throated blue warbler arrived in 1935 in Vicksburg, Michigan. Another interesting, important, but harder to notice often is the date you last see something. So this is in this case, last seen 4 days later, which tells me that this is a bird migrating through this city in Michigan. But you could have a last seen or last observed in the fall as well, right? Status. What do I mean by status? Status is something doing something? So it's not, I saw this leaf out on this day. It says, I'm going out every day and saying, do I see flowers? Yes, I do. Or no, I don't. Or I'm not sure because I'm not really sure if this is a flower yet because it's a plant I'm not so familiar with. So this is what's called status. And then from Jefferson's record, you can record duration. How long was something flowering? Or how long was the growing season? So that's another thing that can be recorded. So take-home message 3, many different kinds of events to record, different ways to record, and what you do and how you record really depends on your goals and your motivations for doing it. So I'm going to step back just for a minute because I forgot to ask, do any of you take phenology records?
I have, but I kind of gave it up in a high school classroom. There's not a lot of time.
Yep.
I have as well. We've done tree diaries over the course of the year.
Uh-huh. Great. Yep, and yeah, I'll take.
Have you done anything with, or is the WCCO and the Jim Gilbert data big enough or long enough?
So funny that you asked that. Yeah, Jim and I have been corresponding and about his data set and about actually developing this Minnesota network to observe. And Jim, we had a workshop, and Jim's message to me and to everyone else was, do something. I've been talking about this and wanting to get something going for 20 or 30 years now, and things haven't flown yet. So he said, do something. But yes, Jim has a record. Anyone from the Rochester area and know Dave Palmquist's radio show on phenology? So Dave Palmquist has a record. His is tiny little hand notes that I have a few sheets of that will be a lot of work to extract, but there's a lot there. John Latimer, if people are from the like Grand Rapids area, has a radio show. So they are all kind of part of what I'll show you, this Minnesota Phenology Network, and we're trying to get more people observing and working with their old data sets. All right, I'm going to talk. The last part is just showing some resources for recording. If you are excited or inspired or want to do this more formally. I'm going to talk mostly about something called the USA National Phenology Network. And this is a national effort to encourage observations of these phenological events. They cover animals and plants. And their mission is really to collect and make data and information available to scientists, resource managers, so people who manage parks, and natural areas, and to the public. And also to encourage people of all ages, and what do I say, from K to gray, to observe and record phenology. And they are a national network. There are people involved in this project that really are interested in national level data. And that's a place where contributions can be made too. So how do you observe there? Well, they have this thing called Nature's Notebook. And what it is, it's multi-taxa, which just means many different plants and animals, national scale system to monitor phenology. And what they do is they're trying to recruit people from across the nation to go out there and collect phenology data in a standard way and enter it into a national level data set to kind of gain information on how the planet's changing and why. And this is what it might look like if you went in and you've selected a plant species to monitor, and then you printed out a data sheet. So the cool thing about this is you can go in, you can pick any particular plant. It can be overwhelming because they have hundreds and hundreds of things, but if you say, I have this maple in my backyard, I want to follow that, you can find maple. You can find a description of maple. You can find a description of the things that they suggest to monitor. And then you can say, enter that record in and print out a data sheet and take that out in your backyard and record. You can do it on your phone too. They have a little app. And they are all about this status. They want to know what's happening. They want you to observe multiple times. They feel like there's value in doing that. And so you go out there, and here they talk about breaking leaf buds as the first. Leaves, do you see leaves? Yes, no, I'm not sure. And one of the things I would say if you are interested in doing this is that the amount of information you can gather here can be really overwhelming. You don't have to do it all. Even if you just wanted to follow breaking leaf buds for a bunch of species, that's useful. So one of the things that I tell people in terms of using this system is don't be overwhelmed. If there's more things than you feel like you can do any small piece of it, and it makes a difference, and it adds to the data set.
I feel like there's less and less of that stuff happening, so in some ways it's easier. Like, because before all that stuff used to kind of be happening at the same time, not exactly, but like, I feel like there's less flowers, like the lilacs come out at a weird time, everything's.
Right, so if things are more spread out, then you don't have so much to do at any given time. Yeah. So I'm going to skip this to give us a little time to chat on these last two. And then I'm just going to point out a couple of educational resources. The top is from the USA NPN, the Nature's Notebook. They have an area where they have a bunch of actual lesson plans where they mention, is this formal, informal education, what grade level is it pitched at for different things. One example is something called the Flight of the Pollinators, Nature Salutes after school program, Phenology Gardens. So these are resources for implementing some of these phenological observing in classrooms or in educational. They also have this thing called the Educators Clearinghouse, which I had not seen before, and it was really useful. You go in and say, I'm in this age group and I want this kind of stuff, and then you get this whole database list of all these different resources, not necessarily just phenology. The other project, and I bring it in because the NPN is great for adult education. It's great for like middle school and high school, but implementing it in elementary school can be tough because of the kind of level of detail. And there's this other program called Project Budburst that actually grew out of the Phenology Network called, and they have a Budburst Academy where you can get training. And then they have this program called Budburst Buddies, K-6 resources for monitoring phenology. And then they have these classroom activity guides, which unfortunately I was looking there and they're not all phenology related, but those are some educational resources. And they actually, when I've talked to both organizations, they say, oh, you know, especially K-3, point people here because this, the materials are more appropriate and more accessible to that age group than some of the materials here. So I will close just letting you know that we are working to get a Minnesota network off the ground. Right now we just have a Facebook page. We have a little bit of funding to actually develop, in conjunction with the national network, a Minnesota page. So when you went there, you would see Minnesota and you would see, you know, a set of experts recommend following these 5 or 10 things. So a little bit like less overwhelming than the big page if you're not sure what you want to monitor, and a little bit more directed. That's in process right now, so kind of keep your eye out for the local network here. And with that, I just thank a bunch of people who have been involved in this, and you guys for listening and participating. It looks like we have some time, so I'm happy to answer more questions or have more discussion about the topic, clarify things that if I sped through.